Good morning, everyone. This will be our first presentation for our conference. Today we'll be doing CARIE'S Older Adult Restorative Justice Program. Just so everyone knows, the Q&A portion will be handled at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to place all your Q&A questions into the Q&A section, and those questions will be answered at the end of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Josh. Hi, everyone. My name is Mariana Lorenz, and I am from the Center for Advocacy for the Rights and Interests of the Elderly, also known as CARIE. We're based out of Philadelphia, and you'll be hearing about our organization a little bit more in the program if you're not familiar with it. But I really appreciate this opportunity for me to share our older adult restorative justice program that we had implemented and sort of how the project went, lessons learned, some of the things that, to think about if we had this opportunity again to continue this project and what it would look like. So I just appreciate you all for joining. And I thought, because unfortunately I was not organized enough to get some polls together, but this is a good practice of Q&A. And I see we have a good bit of us attending today. If you just want to put in the Q&A, like, what is your how familiar are you with restorative justice already? Because we will talk a little bit about principles of restorative justice. And also, if you primarily work in victim services or do you work with older adults? And it's a voluntary, participation, but it's a good practice for Q&A. So I encourage you to put that in there. And you'll find the Q&A on the left-hand side of your screen. Okay. Well, I don't want to take too much time because I know our time is limited. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as Josh had mentioned, we'll take questions at the end. And like I said, I'm happy to address as much as I can with the time that we have. And I know it's limited, and I know it's first day, conference presentation. So why don't we get started? So I'll share my screen here. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. My presentation was not showing up as an option to share. Okay, there it is. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay. So, let's get to our agenda. As I said, we're going to talk a little bit about CARIE, the organization that I work for, and also Good Shepard Mediation Program, who was our partner with this project. We'll also have a little bit of an introduction to restorative justice. I know this is something that more and more people are becoming more familiar with. And so I'm just going to touch on it a little bit again, because I know we have limited time, because really I want to base the focus of the discussion is our program. So if you're not familiar with CARIE, excuse me, our focus is advocacy for older adults. I supervise our victim services and supports program that's focused on elders. And I'll talk a little bit about that more on the next slide. But we have been in Philadelphia. Actually, next year we're celebrating our 45th year, and the mission is pretty straightforward. I mean, our programs are there to promote the well-being, rights, and autonomy of older adults, and we have a number of programs that are very focused on this mission. And when I mentioned, and you'll see this a lot for when we talk about CARIE'S, our case to cause model. So even though we're providing these individual services to older adults or their caregivers or family members or neighbors, concerning older adults, we are very involved in systematic advocacy as well. So I guess one example of that in, sort of in our world of victim services and supports was that back last fall or in the spring, there was a big legislative push on the federal level to kind of revise how VOCA funding, to ensure that there was sufficient VOCA funding to get to states, to get to our individual programs, to make sure that we're providing the services that we need to victims of crime. And I had, excuse me, I had got together with some other had suggested to some other local victim services providers, like, hey, let's get a letter, let's sign it, let's get it to our local congressional folks and our 2 senators, just to put that out there that, hey, this funding is important for our work. This helps victims of crime. And, eventually there was legislation passed and signed to help with fixing the funds how VOCA is. So again, just an example of like systematic advocacy that we can get involved in. So these are a number of services that CARIE'S provides. I'm going to, I supervise PAVE, which is providing advocacy for victimized elderly. This is our, and the services that we provide are similar. If you're in victim services, is court accompaniment, ensuring that their victims are understanding of what their rights are. They are aware, they're notified of court hearings, they're notified of VCAP, all of those things. And we also have a short-term counseling program that we can make available. And I will add that most of our clients are individuals who either, I would say they're typically 60 and over. We do make exceptions to that. It's not a hard, someone's in their 50s or they have a severe chronic illness or they refer to us, like we will assist them or make sure that we get them to the right program who can assist them. And also, we also have a program, it's like a security fund. So for older homeowners who, if they had a theft or a break-in their home, a door or window was damaged, we have a service that we can provide repairs to those windows and doors at no charge to them. And so that's a fairly unique program that we have. And we're often, I think most of that, things that happen to the crime that impacts victims that's not the only thing going on in the lives of a victim. And we're often, sort of tag teaming with our other services, our other programs to assist individuals. So we're often maybe in touch with ombudsmen or those advocates who work in the CARIE line, which was the program that I supervised before coming to the PAVE program. And just a little bit about Good Shepherd. They are in Philadelphia. They're known as they're a community justice center. Their services, they have mediation services, and they were actually a program that when I was in CARIE line and I would take calls from families who had disagreements about how to care for an older loved one, whether that's siblings who just didn't agree on, which aid service to use, or there was disagreements about how money should be handled, things of that nature. I would often refer them to Good Shepherd because they had mediation services for, for families and and an older adult that can be involved in with as well when there were these conflicts about how care should be provided to an older person. So they've been pretty well established in Philly for quite some time. And in fact, I know they were just recently acquired by a big organization, Cora, but mediation is a big service they have. And then they were also, so their role in our project is that they would provide the restorative justice facilitations. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, what is restorative justice, and some of the types of facilitations that were offered in the program. So, again, when thinking of restorative justice, and I think the biggest takeaway from looking at something, restorative justice versus our traditional criminal justice system, is that in restorative justice, it's really putting the victim of the crime or the person who had been harmed really more of the center of the process. Because even though victims, we are advocating for victims in the criminal justice system, helping to navigate it, there are times when I think we all know, there's just times when there's things in the criminal justice system that are done and the victim may not necessarily agree with it. So this is an instance where a victim is really more of the center. I think many of you are probably familiar with the Office of the Victim Advocates examples of restorative justice, like their victim offender dialogue program. And for those of you who are not familiar with that program, I mean, that's something where either the victim of a crime or a offender who is, because to be registered with OVA, the offender is serving a state prison sentence. It's usually it's something that's facilitated. It's a voluntary and it's facilitated after the sentencing, the person has served their time. So, and then of course that brings, and there's, and that can bring, there are benefits to participating in that if people voluntarily do so to do that. So that's why I would say the biggest takeaway with, one of the things with restorative justice, and it's becoming more and more, I think, familiar with folks who have not been as familiar with it. I know when I started supervising the PAVE program and embarking on this project, I was somewhat aware of what restorative justice was, but I definitely had to become more and more familiar with it when this project was implemented. These are the types of processes that could be, that can be options when it comes to restorative justice. You have now, I mentioned the Victim Offender Conference, which is, I think most people, if they have some familiarity with restorative justice, that's what most people think of is a victim offender having a dialogue. And I should say, I mean, with all these processes, I mean, it's a facilitation. There's preparation done before any of them take place. Interestingly enough, when we implemented this program, one of the things that we did, our advocates participated in a training on restorative justice, and the training was held as a circle process. So you're not just learning about a certain type of facilitation, but you're actually participating in a circle. And and as pointed out here, the circle has a talking piece. That's, when you get the talking piece, that's your time to, to speak on something or have the option to pass it around. And it was structured questioning and learning. And so one of the things I took away from, getting more, learning more about restorative justice and was being able to participate in a circle and seeing sort of how, just the impact of what a circle can do. So I was grateful for that opportunity. So these were these were our project objectives when we were able to implement this. Certainly, and we wanted, as with restorative justice, one of the principles is trying to facilitate a healing of relationships between an older victim of crime and the person who harmed them. We wanted also an ability to connect victim services and community resources to older adults who where abuse might be unreported. For those of you who are more familiar with elder abuse, it's known to be underreported. That has been something that's an occurrence that has been for years. I mean, and I've been in aging services for 14 years now. So we were hoping that we had thought, this could be a way for older adults who didn't want to necessarily report to protective services, or potentially to depending to law enforcement, like maybe this is a way that they can address harm that had happened to them. Also, it's providing a framework to develop sustainable older victim adult-driven plans for future needs and care. We are CARIE as an organization is very big on the idea of autonomy and putting older adults. And I think most victim service providers will agree with this, is that the client is the individual who's really driving the car. And we wanted to make sure that they were sort of at the center in terms of they were at the center of whatever agreement was put in place, whatever, if care to ensure they could stay in the community, all of those things. So that was certainly a objective that we had. And then also one objective that we had as well was hoping to avoid potentially for unnecessary, what we mean by unnecessary institutional placement and loss of rights, meaning so that if you have this conflict within families and an older adult where, unfortunately it's at a point where let me go back. One of the issues with elder abuse is that it can potentially lead to placement in a nursing home, whether that's because of neglect, whether that's because with financial exploitation, that a person loses so many funds, or not able to sustain themselves living in their home in the community. So this was a way to hopefully, having this program, it could help to address elder abuse before it got to a place where now the person was so compromised that the care that was necessary for them would be in a nursing facility, or so bad that now guardianship might be in question, because depending on where they're maybe if they had some cognitive issues and they weren't able to direct their own care. So that was these are some of the hoping to achieve in implementing this project. So a little bit about the timeline. So our project was awarded in spring 2019, and we had go through a whole hiring process and also connecting with Good Shepard Mediation. That was through Sue Krug. And so that was in the summer again. And then the whole, just even the planning of the program, how, folks would be referred to us, like how the referral process to Good Shepard, all of that, the planning, that went from about September for about 3 months. Then we started out our outreach, and I don't know if you, I'm sorry, I'm chuckling, but it's like, if you'll see here our outreach to organizations started in January and, to March 2020. And that was a huge huge event happened with COVID happening. And I'll talk more about that a little later, but our outreach had included, in the beginning, we had done a lot of outreach with partners that we had worked with. So for example, the Senior Law Center, that they're a senior legal Advocacy organization, if you're not familiar with them. Older Adult Protective Services in Philadelphia, our Ombudsman program. Ombudsmen are individuals who are advocates for those who are in nursing homes or personal care homes. We had also done we also had started some outreach, making contacts with senior center managers, retiree groups, church groups, also senior housing. Sometimes, oftentimes they may have a social worker or like a supports coordinator in senior subsidized housing that we would do outreach. And we ended up getting our first referral around February. I think it was February, March in 2020. And we had continued our outreach and working with victims till about September 2021. Oh, I will say part of our outreach as well is, I think we also did outreach with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. We had tried to do outreach with the Defenders Association, but that unfortunately we weren't able to connect and do that in time. But this was sort of like the process of how our program would work. And the most simplest, I guess, like the simplest way that I would explain folks are asking me, like, what is this? What is your role in a restorative justice program? I would usually make an analogy to our current services. So, what we currently do oftentimes is help older individuals navigate the criminal justice system. We advocate for them. We connect them to supports and services that are needed after they've been impacted by a crime. With the Restorative Justice Program, the role of the advocate in this case is now we're helping to navigate and advocate for them in a restorative justice process. So in this instance, we would either receive referrals from maybe some of the partner organizations that we outreach to, or some of the senior communities that we done outreach with. And then, we often would get referrals from individuals who contacted us as well sometimes. And they, in this, then we would maybe, depending on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of cases that we had, but if we, if the advocate, if we had felt like, oh, this sounds like maybe this could be an opportunity to utilize restorative justice, we would suggest that to them. And then older victim would elect that. And then we would refer that individual to Good Shepherd, because their role in this process was they were going to be the ones who would help with preparing individual, first of all, contacting all the necessary parties to be part of the process, decide what type of facilitation, whether that's a family group conference or victim offender dialogue or circle that I talked about. They would be responsible for getting all the parties together. They would be responsible for preparing the parties. And our role was to help with advocating for that older. So ensuring that so that could be participating in the preparation process. That may mean participating in the facilitation itself, and also connecting to what other services they could potentially need. And so I think I touched on all those points there. As I said, as I talked about we had to, when we would be alerted to individuals who potentially could want to, we would suggest this process if they, if they wanted to be more involved in addressing the harm that had taken place. They don't necessarily want punishment for the person that harmed them. I think this is something that we hear often from victims of crime, that, especially if it's someone that they know, they may not, they are, especially in instances where like mental health or addiction are issues, they want their loved one to get help. So if they were interested in sort of addressing harm, in this way, that's where we would, suggest to have them talk with Good Shepherd. Again, another key thing is that all the parties have to want to participate in this process. And they're also, again, like, part of this process is that it's going to help to address healing and accountability for, healing on the part of the victim, and for the offender to take accountability for their actions. I know I'll just share one case that we had, because I know, again, with our time being limited and all, but our very first case was an individual who, older woman, owned her home, and she was unfortunately having, her daughter had physically threatened her. And we actually learned this woman had contacted us because she had multiple windows broken in her home. So in the process of helping to address the windows being broken by the daughter, she would talk to us about the relationship that she had with her daughter. And I think at the time she was contemplating whether or not to get a protection from abuse order. And we, of course, like, we shared the information in terms of this is how you would apply for a PFA, et cetera, et cetera. But also we talked about the Restorative Justice Program as well, in case if that, because it sounded like at the time that she might have an interest in it. And so she was referred to Good Shepherd, and that ended up, actually, the first case, sort of our client was agreeable to that process. Good Shepherd was successful in contacting the daughter to be agreeable to that process. I can't remember if there were other family members, because that is also an option too, that there's sort of other family members close by are kind of involved and knowledgeable of the situation. Like, it could maybe be a family group conference, but they did come to some resolution to, for the daughter to address what she needs to address and take accountability for what she had done. And the client was agreeable to that. We would check in with the client just to kind of make sure everything was okay. Because usually at the end of these facilitations, there are agreements that are made. And again, one of our roles is just kind of checking in to make sure that people feel the agreements are being held out. Do people feel safe? All those things. So this is some of the data that we had, and I am going to blame COVID. I think we were, I will be very upfront. I mean, I was disappointed with a number of referrals we ended up getting and cases that went through. And again, I think COVID just played a huge, huge, huge part of it. And of course, that's not something that who could have controlled that or anticipated that. But 18 is still, like I said, that was about one per month that we had that went through this project. 4 ended up completing the RJ process, meaning that the parties got together, the meetings that were facilitated, and agreement was made. There was actually this one notable one part. We had one client participate in sort of the process of preparing. She had a neighbor dispute, what ended up happening was, and typically the way that Good Shepherd would contact the other parties is like through a letter. And in this case, it was a neighbor dispute, and the client went through a prep process, but she had said that, I guess, the harassment that had been going on between her and her neighbor, she said, I think it stopped because once the letter was received by Good Shepherd, it seemed to be a change in how that relationship was. So she then felt like, okay, maybe it's not necessary to potentially go through this. And even so, I don't even think that neighbor I guess the letter, in this instance, the letter was just sort of enough to be a motivator for the neighbor to stop, and things had gotten better. You'll notice here that we had a number of folks who either declined the restorative justice facilitation, or they didn't get a response from the participating party. And that was a huge issue, is that either folks were, we would certainly, when they would speak with advocates and then a good Shepard explaining the process, doing out, and talking about how it would go. But you would have some folks who would say, well, I think I want to wait it out. Or there would be elder individuals or family members who are agreeable to the process, but they couldn't, but for whatever reason, not all the parties could come to the table to get the facilitation going. The types of, cases that we had seen, we had saw a few family conflicts, usually something centered around like an elder abuse allegation, maybe caregiver neglect or financial exploitation, which I neglected to put there. There were a couple of individuals who had disputes with their neighbors, either mostly, harassment, who were interested in maybe facilitating this process. And then we actually had a couple of older individuals referred by our ombudsman who had conflicts with nursing home staff and trying to get a conference with nursing home staff, the older individual. But unfortunately, those did not, again, it was just it was difficult at times to get everyone who needed to come to the table. So here are some, challenges to the program. COVID is the most obvious. I mean, as I said, we were planning to do, we had these outreach plans done, especially, again, with various senior communities throughout in Philadelphia, and COVID just halted that. I mean, we had still a chance to do, and actually when I talked to Sue about her thoughts, I mean, one of the things that we could at least move the facilitations to Zoom, and I think that helped. She didn't feel that was a barrier, and I didn't either, but it was just more or less, I think that just really hindered our ability to do the kind of outreach we wanted to do. We did do a couple of presentations that we could broadcast on YouTube and again share with senior groups that maybe had a Facebook following, but unfortunately COVID just for a good just restricted a lot of in-person, which was something I think everyone was so much more used to doing. One of the other challenges too, I think we were expecting a huge, we were expecting referrals from older adult protective services and law enforcement, and that just, especially with older adult protective services, and again, it's not, they were, even during COVID, they were limited in, when I say limited in their work, they were, they had to change how they addressed elder abuse, as well. So again, they had to change how they had to investigate reports of elder abuse. And I think we were anticipating getting more referrals from them, and that just did not materialize. And I think I mentioned before, again, having the necessary parties to agree on agitation. So that was one of the biggest challenges, where you would have an older individual who was wanting to participate in this process and address harm that had happened to them, but the offending party they would not respond to the letter request to participate. So that was a huge issue, and I think that's sort of what is it that could help to motivate people to address it. So even though our project, again, these are the project, I think there were certainly outcomes that we did meet. I think there's things that we had learned from it. And these are some reflections that through my time with this program and talking with the advocates who have worked in this program and some other folks, some reflections to think about when trying to pursue something like this. Now, in Philadelphia itself, there is a growing restorative justice movement. There's the Restorative Cities Initiative through the Metropolitan Christian Council. Dr. Donna Jones is a big leader in this. And this actually, if you go on their website, there's opportunities to be trained as a facilitator. I think there's a desire to use restorative justice as, more frequently. So maybe our program didn't have quite the response that we were hoping that it did. It certainly doesn't mean that there's not hope for restorative justice in the future, because there is a growing movement, especially in Philadelphia. And I at least from what I've been seeing. The Restorative Response Program, this was actually a newer program that that had involved addressing crimes. So this is another type of program that's been implemented. I'm sorry, I'm mixing things up here. I apologize. So the Restorative Response Program, this is implemented more in the summer. This was a response to, in the summer 2020, there was a lot of civil unrest in Philly. And this was a way to help address those who were arrested for nonviolent crimes, and use the RJ process to help address, if there was, for the owners of business or owners of property and those who may have been arrested as part of the civil unrest. This was a sort of an alternative than necessarily going through a prosecution. So this was a program that had been started it was like an agreement with the DA's office and the Defenders Association. And then just recently now, the district attorney's office is doing a restorative justice pilot program, and focused on for younger people, juveniles who were accused of a crime. For older adults, in the spring of 2021, and I just mentioned the links that I have here, that the PowerPoint will be distributed after the conference, so you can access these links. But in this, I would say last fall and the spring of this year, there've been a couple of symposiums. There was a webinar about how can restorative justice be utilized to address elder abuse. And so I think, again, a lot of the focus is on, what service providers are thinking about this and what are the potentials of that. So if you're interested in sort of hearing the perspectives of service providers, there's a good webinar that was through the California Elder Justice Coalition. And then I also have linked here an article from Lisa Nirenberg, who leads the California Elder Justice Coalition, about how RJ can potentially address financial exploitation. And so that was an interesting read as well, because again, it's one of those issues where, elder abuse is underreported. There's concerns sometimes with elders whether or not they wanted to address. They're concerned about their caregiver or their loved one, getting into trouble or getting reported, and maybe that's why they don't report. And can this potentially be a route to address financial exploitation? The two last things I'll just say is that, I think one of the big things that I think I learned the most is that there needs to be more outreach and education about their justice to elders. Again, I think one of our mistakes was that we had, in early outreach, we were focusing outreach on professionals who, that elders would interact with. But I really think we should have maybe, next time is doing more education for different communities of older adults. And just so that they're clear on what this is, they're clear on what the potentials can be, and potentially a way for them to become more familiar with it so that they decide to, use it to address potential elder abuse. And that's my contact information. So I'm available through email or phone. If you have questions about the project, I know we're running out of time, but I'll stop sharing my screen. But that's my contact information. And again, you'll get this PowerPoint done. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Because I know we only have a few minutes left. But I wanted to thank you for listening to my experience with this project. As I said, I don't think restorative justice is a growing movement. It's not, I think there's certainly opportunities for those who provide services to victims of crime and older adults to utilize this. I am hoping that there are opportunities in the future for us to use restorative justice principles again in addressing elder abuse. I am definitely interested. I think one of the key takeaways for me was that the way I think in hoping to do more outreach with older adults and their families and them being more familiar with it and what the potential it can be, is that hopefully will help to shape what is needed to help getting that feedback is really going to help shape what the program is needed to best fit their needs, because that is the hope. Okay, so a couple questions. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't want to get to all of them. Yes, so thank you. Yeah, so it was, again, as you saw, there were instances where it was difficult to get the offender to participate in the process. As you saw in just the 18 cases that we had, I think it was difficult. And again, I think the question is, and I would have this conversation a lot with my one advocate. It's like, is the motivation going to be the threat of prosecution potentially, or, is like, or what is the motive? How can we motivate an offender to come to the table? So that's, that I think that's kind of one of the things that maybe more research is needed. Because I think what we're most familiar with it is, like I said, in OV8, it could be an alternative through your traditional, prosecution. But we were hoping to utilize it to almost as like it's a lot of a prevention. I don't want to say from things getting worse. That's the best way. That's how I would probably describe that, especially with elder abuse. Yeah, so Tatiana, thank you from PCAR. Yeah, so I hope some of those links, because there is a growing dialogue about utilizing restorative justice principles to address elder abuse. I mentioned the California Elder Justice Coalition. There was a symposium that was with Syracuse. So again, there's a lot of thoughts with service providers, academics. I think what is more needed is like some outreach, some survey, whether that's focus groups or an online survey about finding out what are older adults' familiarity with restorative justice, what is needed for them to, what would they want in a process for them to participate in it. And then on the other side of it is, well, how can we motivate someone who potentially that we know offended them or hurt them? How do we get them into that process? So I think that's, that's another key thing too. Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just reading through your, Okay. Oh, great. I'm glad to see there's some aging service providers part of this. So I'm happy to connect with you about our program and I know we're at 10 o'clock. So I just appreciate the comments and the questions. Please feel free to connect with me to learn more. If you have questions about the program, I know we only had a limited amount of time, but I'm happy to hear from those of you who have put input in the Q&A, that there is a growing interest in utilizing RJ for helping address elder abuse, and would be happy to connect with you more about how to bring this to your community. So thank you so much.
All right, I'd like to thank our presenter for that presentation on restorative justice. Thank you for taking your time out of your busy day to talk with us today. That was very helpful. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to place them in the Q&A at this time. Otherwise, we'll be ending the broadcast and heading towards our next presentation later this day. Thank you so much.